My story is sort of like the unsinkable Molly Brown. I grew up in a coal mining town in Colorado, and I was always a weird kid. While everybody else was playing Little League baseball, I was off in the dry arroyos near my home digging up fossils and, being maladaptive in many different ways. And the thing that I was always tracing or looking for was a kind of iridescence that adheres to certain kinds of matter, certain situations, and even certain kinds of people. So it started out with a fascination with minerals, a rock hound, and then that led into fossils. And that led to butterflies, which was a lifelong obsession until so much pummeling with Buddhist ethics made me give it up a few years ago. But resentfully, I must say. Buddhism is fine, but no one knows the pleasure of the capture of a birdwing ornithopterid in the jungles of Saram. I mean, you want to talk about hard wiring in the human organism? We've been insectivores for 9 million years, and there's a thrill there in the capture of a large butterfly that well, sorry to drift off into... Forgive me. Iridescence, yes. And so then the butterflies sort of carried me along for a while, and then when puberty hit, pineal symbolism overwhelmed everything else, and I got into rocketry. And, the compounding of fuels and the launching of these things from the local baseball diamond and airport at incredible peril to myself and the people around me. And then I discovered at a certain point, I had always been a kind of a science chauvinist. And then at a certain point, I discovered art, literature, poetry, music, dance, theater, the whole of the humanities came flooding in. But the guiding aesthetic was always an aesthetic of the weird. I guess I should mention that I'm a double Scorpio. But the aesthetic of the weird drove me, and nothing was strange enough. I loved the science fiction films of the 1950s, and I was into the music of John Cage early on. And of course, all of these things funneled me toward psychedelics. I mean, psychedelics are like the quintessential essence of this aesthetic of the weird. Once you get to psychedelics, it's like you've hit the main vein of weird. No more do you have to closet yourself in the attic with your copy of Hieronymus Bosch. You can now, move out into the real thing. So that propelled me to a lot of traveling. And traveling, I think, is second or third in importance in the human experience. I mean, I would say sexuality, psychedelic drugs, and travel. This is, my prescription for, destroying your digestive tract or something. And I went first to Africa, and then to the Seychelles Islands, and then to India, and lived in Japan for a while, and then eventually went back to Asia. And I had encountered LSD in Berkeley, where I went as an undergraduate in the fall of 1965. That was the other thing about me. I was incredibly lucky in that a kid from a cow town in Colorado, I was able to find my way to ground zero of the cultural scene. I was able to put myself at the corner of Shattuck and Bancroft in the fall of 1965. So the whole thing was just being staged for my benefit, I thought. Well, so then I became very interested in psychedelics, and I actually smoked DMT early in 1967, a tremendously fortuitous moment in the history of my the development of my thinking. Apparently, SRI, the Army, was trying to develop a drug called BZ, which was an aerosol-delivered tryptamine that would, a hallucinogenic tryptamine that would be delivered by an artillery shell into a Vietnamese village. And while everybody was stoned on DMT, our boys would come in and kick butt or do whatever they do. And a 55-gallon drum of solid DMT had been boosted off the back of a truck by some Stanford graduate students. So I had this benchmark, you know, DMT. And I took a fair bit of LSD in those undergraduate years at Berkeley, but I have to confess, it was never easy for me. It always seemed like psychoanalytic Drano, kind of. And after each acid trip, I would say, my God, I'm not going to do that again. Well, of course, then 2 weeks later, I would be back to it. But my style has always been to be a reader and to inform myself. So I read The Doors of Perception and Havelock Ellis and Weir Mitchell, all these people I mentioned this afternoon. And what fascinated me was how they insisted on visions, particularly Havelock Ellis's descriptions of his mescaline experiences, where he says, architectural ruins dripping with globular jewels, strange statuary leering from darkened doorways. And I said, hey, I want it. How do I get that? And LSD didn't really do it for me, although my most satisfying LSD trips, and this is just maybe a practical suggestion, were in the presence of good hashish. Hashish seems to be able to pull the pure translucency of LSD toward a much crazier, more psychedelic, more mushroomic-like place, at least for me. So then I went to India and I knocked around for a while, and I quickly became incredibly disillusioned with all of that. I mean, I don't know, folks. Everybody has different experiences, and you can only judge your own path. But I just thought it was the most outrageous con that has ever come down the pike. That, maybe millennia ago there was something going on, but it has been so enfolded by priestcraft and dogma and class consciousness and everybody's out to con everybody else, and there you are. What do you know? I mean, these people have been at this for 1,000 years, and you fly in from Malibu, sugar and money heavy, into their midst. Well, they know just exactly how to turn you every way but loose. And eventually all you ask is that they turn you loose, Now, I know there are people for whom this message is unwelcome who are within this room this evening, but I'm not knocking Indian spirituality. I think that there is a great wisdom about how to live that these world religions have accumulated. The problem was I was 23 years old and I wasn't interested in wisdom on how to live. I was interested in how do you get as loaded as possible and then be able to talk about it. So went through all these experiences and was abandoned by the love of my life, and all kinds of things happened. And eventually I decided that the answer lay in the Amazon. And so in late 1970, I had been living in Vancouver, British Columbia. I couldn't enter the States because I had a price on my head. Not much of one, but an uncomfortable situation to be in. So then I went to the Amazon for the first time with my brother and a couple of friends who came with me from the States, and then we quickly made common cause with a woman down there, and she came with us. So it was 2 women and 3 guys, and we were considering that that I was the oldest and I was 25 years old. As I look back on it, we were an incredibly serious and well-informed group of 22 through 25-year-olds. And our intent, we had all graduated from the school of DMT. We were all post-revolutionary Berkeley communard types. And we had collectively decided that the only hope lay in somehow getting into the DMT flash for longer than a minute to a minute and a half, and that the strategy for doing this must be then to go to the Amazon and explore these psychoactive drugs. And the one that we were interested in is one that even today has yet to become an item on the Malibu consciousness circuit, a drug called ukuhe. Ukuhe, it's used only by the Witoto, Bora, and Muinani tribes of the lower Putumayo of Comissaria Amazonas in Colombia. Very limited geographic area in a completely remote part of the Amazon. And what was interesting to us was the anthropological reports were that they rolled it up, it was the resin of a tree, and that they rolled it up into little pills, and that they took the little pills and then they would lie in their hammocks and they would speak to the little man. And so we said, this has got to be it. And Dick Schultes, Richard Evans Schultes of Harvard, had already published on the chemistry of ukuhe, and it was definitely contained DMT. So we said, okay, these people have found the way into what we then called the beta level, just for shorthand. So the way into the beta level was to be achieved by ukuhe. So we put together this expedition, and we descended the Putumayo River, which is the border between Colombia and Ecuador and Peru, to a place called San Jose del Encanto on the Rio Igaraparaná, which flows into the Putumayo there. And at that point, it's a 120-kilometer overland 5-day walk to a remote mission called La Chorrera. And most places in the Amazon are historyless, but La Chorrera had a very dark history behind it, which I didn't really know at the time, and probably very few people in this room have ever heard of or know anything about what's called the Putumayo rubber horror. What this was a rehearsal for for Hiroshima, Auschwitz, you name it. It went on from 1912 to 15 in the Amazon, when, in a frantic effort to get natural rubber to fight the First World War, British banks bankrolled an episode of genocidal brutality that is remarkable both for the depth of the horror and for how thoroughly it's been completely forgotten. And what they did, these British banks, is they financed this Peruvian mafia called the House of Arana to basically enslave Indians over a vast area of the Amazon and force them to extract the natural rubber under pain of death. And there are endless stories of the atrocities. People had the soles of their feet removed by machete if they didn't meet the rubber quotas, and just nightmare after nightmare. If you want to read about it, there's the British Royal High Commission under Roger Casement. And that was another story. You see, Roger Casement was the last man hung for homosexuality by the British Crown. He had been the British Consul General in Rio de Janeiro and had exposed this rubber atrocity and all the collusion of British banks and stuff like that. But a few years later, he expressed Irish sympathies with the Easter Rising of 1919, and immediately the Foreign Office came forward with love letters between him and Parnell, the Irish revolutionary, and he was hung for being a homosexual. But anyway, La Chorrera had this very dark history of these rubber atrocities. Well, we rolled in there, and immediately there began the unfolding over just about a 3-week period. I mean, a very short length of time, from the 27th of February 1971 until the 22nd of March. So a period of just under 4 weeks. It was like the doorway was standing open. All rational expectation had to be put behind. It was as though our whole lives had built to this moment, and what we thought was a quest for an obscure orally active tryptamine drug, it turned out it was more as though something which had been with us from the cradle actually lured us to this extremely remote place where there was no way out, no radio, no communication of any sort, lured us to this place to then begin this series of unfolding ideas. And these ideas that were released in that 3-week period are basically all I've ever worked with. I haven't had an original thought since March of 1971, essentially. It's just been endless recension and reworking of what happened there. Well, what happened was taking a lot of mushrooms and being in this incredibly natural, beautiful, low toxin environment. I mean, there was barely even radio waves in this place. It was so remote. It was like our minds began to dissolve back into the order of nature. And we began to discover what the order of nature actually is. And it took the form of an idea, which my brother Dennis, who's the pharmacologist of the gang, although he wasn't at the time, he has gone on to become the person he most was before he studied the subject. Now he is a molecular biologist, research pharmacologist, and drug designer. Then he was a 21-year-old kid with a rave. But he proposed that there was a way to take these psychedelic drugs and to use sound to cause a small number of these drug molecules to permanently bond into the DNA. The term for this is intercalate. And it's known now, although it wasn't known then, that many drugs do this. Many drugs do intercalate. You all know how DNA is a double helix with nucleotide rungs on the ladder. Well, certain molecules, especially certain drug molecules, can slide right in between the rungs of that ladder, and without imparting any physical deformation to the molecule, they can change its properties. In fact, this may be how psychedelic drugs work. Now, we're at the edge of known physiology and neurophysiology when we talk like this. One of the great puzzles of biology, or human biology, is the persistence of memory. In other words, it's said that every molecule in your body is cycled within a 5-year period. That, 6 years ago, there wasn't a single atom in your body that is now in your body. The form persists, but the matter is traded in and out, except in one case, which is the neurons do not trade out. The neurons that you're born with are the neurons that you die with. So then the problem here is memory. You can be 70 years old and have an absolutely crystal clear memory of your first day of attending school in that red brick schoolhouse 65 years ago. Okay, conservatively, 7 times every molecule in your body has been swapped out. So where has this memory been all this time that you can pull it up with perfect clarity? This is a great mystery of metabolism, unsolved to this day. There are several possibilities. One possibility is that memories are not located in the body at all. Although suggesting this is no magic bullet, it raises a number of questions, probably as difficult to solve as the original question for which this was proposed as a solution. Okay, what are the other possibilities? The memories must be stored then in the non-degrading part of the body. The non-degrading part of the body is the neural DNA. The cell nuclei of neurons don't change within your lifetime. Well, so then you take this idea to an orthodox molecular biologist or neurophysiologist or geneticist, and they say, well, this is just bunk. I mean, in the first place, you don't understand the concept information. The kind of information which is stored in DNA is sequences of nucleotides which code for protein. To confuse that with an image of your great-grandmother's face is to just, have such a mush of categories that it's hopeless to even talk to you. So Dennis's notion was, he said that some form of superconductivity must be involved. Now, this was 1971. Superconductivity was not known to occur more than 0.3 of a degree above zero absolute. He said, no, there must be room temperature superconductivity going on in the DNA. This must be how the DNA preserves information. Now, if you know anything about superconductivity, it is the perfect physical phenomenon to use for preserving information, because no information degrades in a superconducting circuit. Say you have a ring of supercooled gold and you impart an electric current to this ring. That current, barring interruption of the superconducting state, will circle that gold ring with zero resistance for eternity. Now, the only thing which can cause the superconducting phenomenon to cease is if a high-energy source overwhelms the superconductivity, comes in from the outside and disrupts it. Now, think about the problem that nature faces with the genetic machinery. The key to life is error-free copying. Wherever there's error, then there becomes mutation or problem or incompatibility. So all of the strategies of genetic preservation of information seek to maximize the absence of error. So the perfect mechanism for doing this would be a superconducting mechanism. Now you see, the major cause of mutation in the natural environment is cosmic radiation, ambient cosmic rays, high energy particles that smash into the genome, physically collide with the DNA and break the bonds and disrupt the message so that it can't be copied. Superconductivity would be the natural medium to retard this process. So Dennis's notion was that the DNA was a kind of superconducting storage device, and that in fact what we call the Jungian unconscious, or the racial memory, or the genetic memory, could be tapped into, and that what a drug trip is a neurotransmitter that competes with serotonin, that then broadcasts off this genetic memory bank a slightly different slice of the catalog. Serotonin broadcasts are the equivalent of traffic and weather reports, where it tells you how to get around in the world and where not to go and how to avoid problems. If you swap out the serotonin channel for the psilocybin channel, suddenly it's the equivalent of Pacifica Radio. It's running philosophy discussions and classical music from another planet, you see, because the efficiency and the emphasis of these neurotransmitters is different. Well, so we went through a series of startling revelations and experiences using this idea, because he was dead serious about doing this and decided that I would be the likely candidate for what he called hypercarbylation. And that, we would saturate me with drug molecules, and then he knew how to do the thing to make an ordinary trip turn into the forever trip by locking these molecules into their bond sites. Oh, and that's the piece of the puzzle that I didn't explain that you might not realize. When a molecule is superconducting, when a molecule is at 0 degrees absolute, it becomes superconducting. So if you can cool a molecule to that level, it will immediately bond permanently to whatever is physically nearby. So Dennis said, what you do is you take all these, you saturate your body with these drug molecules, and then using a complex theory of harmonic canceling, which I won't regale you with this evening, he thought there was a way to generate sound that would affect a very small number of these drug molecules and cause them actually to superconductively bond into the DNA. And then the trip would be permanent. The trip would be scripted into the genome, or at least for the life of the organism. And he suggested that if you make the DNA superconducting in this way, that eventually death is no problem. It's just sort of like a shedding, and you go into the rivers and the water and the air, and you become very tiny. You become the size of your DNA nucleus. Well, I thought that this was a very highly unlikely notion, so unlikely that since he was so gung-ho to try it, the best thing to do would be to just let it rip. And if there was something there, that would be interesting, but that I was willing to bet dollars to donuts against it. Well, he set up the experiment, he did the experiment, and he had made very extravagant and inflated predictions about what would happen. He thought that you would literally give birth to your mind as a physical substance. I don't know whether it would flow out of your nose or where it would come from, but he thought that there was a kind of superconducting translinguistic matter, he called it. He thought there was a way to dissolve the boundaries between matter and spirit, and create an obsidian fluid that would be obedient to your own imagination, that would in fact be you. You would just preserve your body as a convenient reference point, but you would actually become this stuff. Well, what happened was not what he predicted, but not nothing. And that was the great puzzlement of this experience, because what happened was immediately after this procedure was carried out, I could tell that something had changed in me. And it was very hard. It took me a few hours to figure out what it was. And what it was it was though a switch had been thrown. And I began to understand. That's all it was. It was, Whitehead defines understanding as the apperception of pattern as such. And suddenly, I began seeing things very differently. I began to see the relationships between things on one level and among levels. And I stopped sleeping. I didn't sleep for 11 days, effortlessly. And every night during this 11 days, in the late evening, I would just become very, very impatient for all these people to go to bed, my companions, because the chatter of the camp would interrupt my thoughts. And what I just wanted to do was I would just go in the jungle and I would just put my hand on a tree and I would just stand and think and think and think and think and think. And it was this endless cascade. It was not like a psychedelic trip. There was no hallucination. There was simply this unfoldment. And it was like as though I was just filled to overflowing with gnosis. I would sit down on the ground and begin thinking, and I would lose myself in my thoughts. And when I would come back to my situation, I would look down in front of myself and see that while I had been thinking, my hands had built a fire out of small sticks. It was as though everything was cognitive activity. Dennis went what would be conventionally called a psychotic episode, but it wasn't a typical psychotic episode. It was a kind of turning inside out, so that he became, in a single moment after the hypercarbylation, it was like he ended up at the other end of the universe, turned inside out and headed backwards. And over the next 14 days, he came through a progressive narrowing of his what he was identifying with, so that first it was the whole universe, then it was the galaxy, then the solar system, then each of the planets moving in, then all life on Earth, then all mammals, then all human beings, then all Irish, then finally all the McKennas there ever were, and then finally the question was he him or me? And then he got that sorted out finally, and then he was fine. Shaken, but fine. We've now reached the 22nd of March, 1971, and I was just, I couldn't talk to anybody. I was in a very, 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 very strange place. I mean, things went on. Well, just as an example, because there wasn't much of this 3D stuff that you could wrap your mind around, but everything was teaching me. Everything had a message for me. And I would go out into the jungle, and I would raise my arms above my head, and I would call the butterflies into me out of the jungle, and they would come. first by dozens and then by hundreds. And I would stand there, and here's how the thought progression would go. I would call the butterflies in, and then it would move me to tears. And so there I am, standing, covered with butterflies, tears of joy streaming down my face, and streaming down my face, and streaming down my face. And finally I begin thinking, so now what? and then I think, the people back at the camp who doubt me, those bastards, wait till they see this. So then I would go to the camp, and I would be smiling, the tiny smile that only Buddhas can manage, and I would invite them into the jungle to see something unannounced. And so they would say, well, I don't know, you're just, all right, we'll go. So then we would go into the jungle, and I would raise my hands above my head, and I would call the butterflies in, and none would come. And these people would just say, oh God, it's getting worse and worse and worse. Your brother is nuts. You have delusions of this is pathetic. I mean, this is a mind in wreckage. This is the green hell. This is the thing we feared the most, you know? And so eventually, and any of you who are self-diagnosed as schizophrenic will agree with me on this, I'm sure. The key to surviving schizophrenia in one piece and avoiding massive intervention by the mental health care authorities is shut up. Shut up about it. Do not talk about it. Of course you can raise the dead and heal the sick and divine distant event, but just shut up about it, or you're not going to make it through. Well, eventually everybody else sort of renegotiated themselves back to some kind of reality. My brother flew back to the States, and I was, in a sense, left in the Amazon to mull all this. And at this point, this pattern perceiving coherency, that was how I described what was coming over me, began to take a special direction. And believe it or not, that's what I want to talk about tonight, is the special direction. I never had, I say I never had any particular interest in the I Ching, but actually, when I was very young, I read it. First I read the James Legge translation, when that was the only one available. It was an old Dover 2-volume deal. And then when the Wilhelm Baines translation came out, I think I bought my copy in '63, and I did it, and because I was a Jungian, I was interested in it because Jung wrote a lot about it. But I wouldn't say I was devoted to it or that I honored it particularly. But I did keep it with me when I traveled, and my habit was to throw it at every new and full moon. And I had done this for years. And so in the wake of these events that I've just described, this inner teaching voice began to turn more and more toward the I Ching. And at first I didn't realize that was what we were talking about, because the dialogue opened very innocently. It opened like this. The voice said, using the common form of address, which it always uses, it said, "Did you know? I'll bet you did know," which is how it always broaches the subject. Did you know? I'll bet you did know. Did you know? I'll bet you did know that every day is made out of 4 other days. I said, that's never occurred to me. I've never heard that idea. Said, oh yes, every day is made out of 4 other days. I said, what do you mean made out of? Said, every day is an interference pattern created by other times in the past. Now, in our scheme of thinking about time, the most important moment in terms of its influence on the moment we call now, is the moment we call now minus one. Now minus one is very, very much like now. In fact, you can't really tell them apart. So we believe that now minus one is the major moment influencing now. The voice said, no, that's cockamamie. That isn't it at all. There are moments spread through time, and they create the resonance of the present. And so I said, well, so you say. And it said, go get graph paper and we'll talk more. Now, what it eventually directed my attention toward is the King Wen sequence of the I Ching. The King Wen sequence is a traditional sequence that is, there are different sequences. What distinguishes the King Wen sequence is that it is the traditional one and the oldest one. An argument can be made that it is the oldest human abstraction in existence because we possess portions of the King Wen sequence scratched onto shoulder bones, scapula, that can be dated to 3500 BC or so. So this is a very, very old pattern that has been preserved through time by human beings. And it's always called the King Wen sequence. And if you own a copy of the Wilhelm Baines translation, you will see in the second part that nobody ever reads, there are commentaries on what is called the sequence. And so the invisible teacher posed the following problem to me. Is the King Wen sequence a sequence? And if so, what are the laws which generate it? You see, it's a completely focused, scholarly, no-nonsense. It's essentially a question in mathematical logic. So I had never thought much about the sequence. So I sat down with my I Ching and I flipped it open and I looked to see if I could see any ordering principle in the King Wen sequence. Well, you only have to it took me 10 minutes. Most people could probably accomplish this more swiftly. But in about 10 minutes of looking at it, I suddenly saw that it isn't 64 hexagrams. It's 32 pairs of hexagrams. And the second member of each pair is formed by turning the first member upside down. Do you see? By inverting the first one, you get the second, and you get these then pairs of hexagrams. If you look at 3 and 4, that's such a pair. 4 is 3 turned upside down. And now, there are 8... I assume everybody knows what the I Ching is. What are hexagrams? Hexagrams are these 6-leveled structures made out of broken and unbroken lines. So when I say turning a hexagram upside down, I'm referring to the inversion of this 6-leveled structure. Now, in the nature of 6-leveled structures made out of solid and broken lines, there will be 8 cases where turning it upside down doesn't make any difference. You meet the first case in the first hexagram. The first hexagram is 6 solid lines. If you turn it upside down, it's still 6 solid lines. So then I realized there's a second rule. And the second rule is, if inverting the first hexagram provokes no change, then all lines change. Okay, now this is not original. I think this is well known to scholars of the I Ching. It was just a revelation to me, but it's well discussed in the literature.